Curioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, Ancient Wales, Episode 2, Daily Life in the Iron Age. As iron usage spread across Europe from its origins in the Central Alps south to Anatolia, we find our Bronze Age British people were starting to define territories in ways that were clear and unmistakable. Boundary ditches and forest clearing were matched with causeways that would span the sometimes murky and boggy landscape. These were then built up in some places with earthworks and sometimes with wooden posts linked to wooden walkways that bridged these boggy swamps that lingered near the edges of islands and of rivers, and in some cases, the ocean itself. Flag Fen in Peterborough saw a massive causeway get built up and cross about a 1 kilometer of distance of this marshland. These paths and tracks were then bordered to help define the landscape, making travel both easier as well as to define locations and communities. This also helped with trades and shipments of goods that would be able to get across landscapes in quicker and easier methods. Day-to-day life was caught up in creating these boundaries and defining what was yours and what was the community, or, in other words, what was the community's and what was the next community over. In the Cambridge Fens, for example, discoveries of the last decade have shown that Bronze Age, at least in some parts of Britain, was different from what was thought originally. In the Fens, they discovered log dugout canoes ranging in length from 3 to 9 meters. 8 of these examples, mostly of oak, were found nearby in 2013. This area would reveal a farm settlement called Must Farm, which consisted of 5 houses raised on stilts above a river and built around 950 BCE. This is fairly late for this housing being built in this kind of style. This was falling out of use at this point, which is something to keep in mind. Archaeologists have already learned more about their diet, featuring the menu of wild boar, red deer, and freshwater fish, similar to pike. They also had farm animals, lambs, and calves, so meat was high on the menu as it would be for many centuries to come. Yet, as firmly as they might be understood in their landscape, it is also known that they were trading fairly far and wide. Beads, some 60 of them apparently from necklaces, were found, and these were made of glass, amber, and jet, and seemed to originate from the Eastern Mediterranean or the Middle East, possibly even Syria and Turkey, showing the distance that they had to travel to get to Britain. But these places were still sites where domestic living happened. Farming was key to survival. There was a suggestion at the end of the Bronze Age that these sites, as I said earlier, were falling out of favor for dry land farming sites. And by dry land, I mean they were farming on the dry land, not that it was dry land farming in the way we might define it now. These sites remained active throughout this period, and some were obviously successful enough to continue. In the case of Must Farm, settlements of rich material culture, from domestic pots and plates to bronze farming implements, showed that the living at this site was not just an isolated group of marginalized people pushed into the wild and unproductive landscape. Instead, archaeologists who dug up the site say it's possible that the location in a river reflected the people's desire to maintain access to what continued to be a trade and communications route, an important part of society even at this juncture. So while we are about to move into the Iron Age, it's important to know and understand that a great deal of settlement was built around areas like this. These were older styles of living, yet they are still existing. And these areas, which began in this period of time, or in some cases at even older time periods, are often still being used today. There are still sites which existed then, which exist in some form or fashion or within effectively a stone's throw from these various locations. So their usage was recognized thousands of years before and continued to be important in the millennia to come. The Iron Age in Britain spanned roughly from 800 BCE to 43 CE, ending with the Roman invasion. In Wales, this was a transformative era. People began using iron tools, which were stronger and more durable than their bronze predecessors. Communities thrived in hill forts, somewhat fortified settlements that were often perched in strategic sites and grounds, usually elevated for reasons we can guess, but we don't necessarily know fully, likely because it helped to defend themselves. One thing I will note about Must Farm, for example, which happens only 100 or so years before the Iron Age begins, is that it collapsed due to a fire. So there's some suspicion that this may be a hostile act that may have driven them out of that location. So warfare and fighting were happening in this age. So obviously having a place where you can defend yourself is a useful thing. But we will come to talk about the fact that these sites aren't always considered to be defensive, that there are other reasons why people think these hill forts were used. So we'll get into that later, though. But let's talk about the roundhouse. Life inside a roundhouse is an important feature of basic British life from the earliest Bronze Age well on, and in some cases going on even into the early medieval period. The roundhouse is one of the most iconic features of Iron Age Britain, and its construction reveals an ingenuity and adaptability of the people who lived in these structures. These homes were carefully designed to endure the challenging climate and foster communal living. They serve as a multifunctional space for families and communities to be able to inhabit. First, in order to build one, you need to choose the site. First step in the construction of a roundhouse was selecting an appropriate location. Communities often chose sites with good drainage, protection from prevailing winds, and access to nearby resources like water, wood, and clay. In hill forts, roundhouses were clustered within the protective ramparts, while in low-lying areas, they were often parts of dispersed villages. The foundations of a roundhouse began with a circular trench into which wooden posts were set upright in the form of a frame in the walls. These posts were then typically made from locally available timbers such as oak, ash, or chosen from other woods which offer strength and durability to be able to stand up to the climate. The walls were then filled in with wattle and daub, a technique that involves weaving flexible branches like hazel or willow between the posts to create a lattice, the wattle, and then this was coated with a mixture of clay, mud, and straw, and sometimes animal dung, the daub, which then dried into a sturdy, weather-resistant surface, similar in a way to adobe houses that were used in the prairies in North America. In some cases, particularly in areas like Gwynedd, roundhouses were constructed with stone foundations and entirely stone walls, reflecting the easy availability of the material and the influence of regional traditions. The roof of the roundhouse was conical and thatched with materials like straw, heather, or reeds. The central wooden pole or ridge beam might have been used to support the roof, though in smaller roundhouses, the walls themselves provided enough structural stability that they didn't need such a thing. The thatch was lightly packed to make it waterproof, with overlapping layers directing rain away from the walls. As you would see in a lot of these roundhouses, there will be a little bit that will hang over the outside wall, and this would allow, much like eaves do, water to drain away from the edge of the building, thus corrupting or causing under the walls being deteriorated. So it makes a lot of sense. And even though it's, by comparison to modern buildings, relatively easy to rebuild, you wouldn't want to do that consistently, especially if the weather gets nasty, as it would. The roof of the roundhouse, which you mentioned, was conical and thatched with material like we mentioned. The doorway was the only opening in the roundhouse, and there was usually only one. Typically low and narrow to minimize heat loss, it was positioned to face typically the southeast, allowing sunlight to enter in the morning and providing protection from the prevailing westerly winds. In some cases, a simple wooden door or animal skin curtain covered the entrance. The floor of a roundhouse was often compacted earth, sometimes covered with a layer of straw or rushes or woven mats for insulation. Over time, floors became hardened by repeated use. Inside, the central hearth was the focal point, used for cooking, heating, and light. Now, if you go into a roundhouse, like a modern reproduction like they have in the Welsh Museum in St. Fagans, you will find this setup and you'll walk in and you'll be mildly surprised, I think. One, it is incredibly dark in there, so that's an issue that you notice almost immediately. The other thing is that the fire at the center does allow for smoke to envelop the area, but it's nowhere near, say, if you tried to do this with a bonfire or specifically with a normal fire where smoke just kind of goes wherever it feels like. Most of the smoke goes straight up and it actually filters through the straw of the thatch. And that is one aspect of thatch roofs that is useful, is that they will leak smoke so that it's not trapped and creating effectively a poisonous smog into the building. It allows it to all sort of seep out over time, which in that way protects everyone from that problem. But I will say it was pretty obvious just how dark it could be in those environments. And even with lighting from the hearth, you would have to get some form of other lighting to help out. Certainly, it's a lot darker than what we would be used to. The primary function of the roundhouse was as a family home. Its circular design distributed weight evenly, making it resistant to strong winds. The thatch roof and thick walls provided insulation to help the interior warmth during the winter, and it helped keep it cool in the summer. One of the aspects of the darkness that would actually be of assistance in the summertime. Roundhouses were multi-purpose spaces. The central hearth served as the cooking area, with pots and cauldrons suspended over the fire. Around a wooden shelves and walls, baskets and clay pots stored tools and food and personal belongings. Beds made of wooden frames filled with straw or heather and covered with woolen blankets, which were arranged across the perimeter. Families slept, ate, and worked in this shared space, emphasizing the communal nature of Iron Age life. Children played near the hearth while adults engaged in spinning, weaving, or repairing tools. Roundhouses often included pits dug into the floor or storage jars buried into the ground to keep food cool and dry. These areas were used for storing grains, dried meats, and other staples, protecting them from pests and damp conditions. Beyond being a home, of course, as we mentioned earlier, the roundhouse was a space for storytelling, teaching, and ritual. The hearth symbolized more than warmth. It was the focal point for communal identity. Oral traditions, songs, and knowledge were often passed from one generation to another next to this intimate setting. In some cases, livestock such as sheep or goats were brought inside the roundhouse during the harsh weather or at night to protect them. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain roundhouses included areas partitioned off for this purpose, especially in rural settlements. The circular design of the roundhouse wasn't arbitrary. It was a practical structure for stability, as I mentioned, and the lack of corners allowed for more weight distribution and reduced the risk of collapse under the pressure of heavy winds or snow. The roundhouse also held symbolic meaning. The circular shape echoed with the cycles of nature, the sun, the moon, and the seasons, which were central to the spiritual worldview of the Iron Age people. Living in a roundhouse space reinforced the connection between the community and the natural world. Keep in mind, these are suppositions, not necessarily fact. Not all roundhouses were the same. Variations in size, material, construction techniques reflected regional differences and available resources, and social hierarchy. Larger or more elaborately built roundhouses may have belonged to community leaders or served as community gathering spaces, while smaller structures were likely homes of individual families. In the hill forts like Castell Henllys, the remains of multiple roundhouses show differences in size and layouts, suggesting a mix of residential and functional buildings, such as workshops or storage houses. Archaeological excavations at sites like Castell Henllys reveal much about the Iron Age domestic life. Charred grain was found in the hearth, indicating diets rich in barley, oats, and wheat, often made into bread or porridge. People also ate meat from sheep, pigs, and cattle, supplemented by wild game and foraged plants. Roundhouses wasn't just a... no, try that again. The roundhouses weren't just acting as shelters, as we mentioned. It was also a hub of activity. Women likely spun wool and wove textiles here, while children learned essential skills through imitation. The communal nature of life meant that the work was often a shared endeavor and strengthened the bond within the groups, keeping in mind that the rainy and somewhat miserable winters made it so that people probably spent a lot more time in these roundhouses than maybe we sometimes would think. The hill fort was more than just a defensive structure, on the other hand. It was a vibrant center of trade, governance, and cultural activity. The ramparts and ditches that defined these settlements were not built only to protect, but also as symbols of power and status. At Trevir, Kitty, one of the most best preserved hill forts in Wales, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of 150 stone houses. These findings suggest a substantial population, perhaps numbering in several hundreds at its peak. Such communities were self-sufficient with stored food in granaries and water collected from nearby springs. Trade was vital too. Artifacts, like the glass beads that we mentioned earlier, imported pottery, and other items indicate connections with other parts of Britain and even with continental Europe. Keep in mind, as we mentioned in the previous episode, iron making actually starts in Europe and starts to migrate into Britain at this time period. This exchange of goods brought ideas and innovation, enriching the Iron Age culture. Life in an Iron Age village was labor-intensive, and community members were contributing to the group's survival. Men and women alike worked the land, tended the crops and the livestock. Iron Age tools like plows and sickles revolutionized farming, making it more efficient and productive, and unlike their Bronze Age counterparts, would last longer and work better. Craftsmanship flourished during this period. Blacksmiths were highly valued for their skill in working iron, creating tools and weapons and jewelry. Weavers produced textiles from wood dyed with natural pigments from plants like woad and madder. Potters made practical yet beautiful vessels for cooking and storage. Artifacts unearthed at sites like Dinorben and Denbighshire provide glimpses into the creativity. For example, intricately designed brooches and torques suggested that personal adornment was important to the Iron Age people as well as functionality. Pottery was essential to the Iron Age life, and it served both practical and symbolic purposes. Excavation at sites such as Dinorben and Castell-Henllys have uncovered fragments of coarse, handmade pottery, giving us insights into their design and use. Iron Age pottery in Wales was typically made using a coiling technique, where strips of clay were layered and then smoothed by hand or with a simple tool. Unlike later periods, potters did not yet use wheels. Clay was then often tempered with materials like crushed shells, sand, or grit to prevent cracking during firing. Once shaped, the pots were then baked in an open fire or simple kilns, leaving them in a rough, unglazed finish with shades of brown, gray, or black. So what is the use of pottery in this age? Large, thick-walled pots were used for boiling stews or porridge over the hearth. These vessels were designed to withstand direct heat and had round bottoms to rest in the embers. Storage jars were tall, narrow jars that stored grain, dried herbs, and other foodstuffs. Some had lids and covers, while others were sealed with animal bladders or wax to keep the contents fresh. Smaller bowls and cups were often used for eating and drinking, though communal eating from shared vessels was also considered to be common. Amphoria-like vessels, which are tall vase-like pottery, were used to store and transport liquids like beer, mead, or water. Archaeological finds suggest some communities imported or traded pottery for more specific purposes. And finally, of course, we have the ritual use. Some pottery fragments, often intricately decorated, were likely used in religious and ceremonial contexts. Broken pieces were often found in burial sites or near water sources, which might have been offerings to gods. And of course, pottery was used in cremation, as people were generally interred into urns. So, of course, that would be another reason why it would be used symbolically. Most Iron Age pottery was functional rather than decorative. Designs were simple, with incision patterns and impressions made using tools, fingers, or even sometimes cords. Geometric shapes like lines, dots, and chevrons were popular motifs. Rarely pottery was burnished to give it a slight sheen, and a testament to the skill of the potters in that age. Certainly this is not to the delicate degree that you'll see later, especially with the Romans, but it still has its own unique skill point and unique appearance. A village potter would have been a respected figure. Their skill is vital to the community's survival. The work was labor-intensive, digging clay from riverbanks, preparing it by removing impurities, and shaping the vessels, managing the firing process, also, of course, being an important aspect. Pottery was traded within and between communities, suggesting its value as both a practical item and a marker of cultural identity. While pottery was central to the life of many, it was part of a broader domestic routine. Women and children worked on tasks like spinning wool into thread, using drop spindles, weaving cloth or on upright looms, and dyeing textiles with plant-based pigments. Men often worked in the fields or tended the livestock, but during the winter months they might have focused on crafting tools or preparing structures or doing things like hunting. Shared meals brought everyone together and reinforced the bonds that held the community tight. Stories, songs, and oral traditions were often passed throughout the hearth, as we mentioned earlier, ensuring that both the knowledge and the tales of the people were kept and were able to endure. By weaving together these elements, pottery, craft, and communal living, we get a vivid picture of the vibrant, interconnected life of an Iron Age household. And in the coming episodes, we'll talk further about this life and how there were other aspects that we haven't mentioned yet, such as warfare and conflict and dealing with consequences of weather change and different things like that. And we'll get into those in further detail as we go along. But this is kind of the introduction of a lot of the basics of life and how they survived and how shelters were built in order to protect themselves. And you can see as we move through the time period, we will see consistently that things continue to change, adjust, and the way that things are done and being done also change with it. Right up until the Romans appear, and that's when things really get dramatically different. But until then, thank you all for listening or watching today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, or you can reach out to me on Twitter or Blue Sky, where I'm Welsh History Pod. And you can also connect with me on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And if you would like to help the research of this podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all once again for listening. Have yourselves an amazing day, and we'll catch you later. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.